Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. There are a couple of seats. There's a seat up here if someone needs a seat. Never mind, it's been taken. It's taken. All right. Due to the inordinate amount of press that this duo has gotten in Telluride, and I'm so thankful to all of the press that has covered this event, I'm not going to really do much of an introduction. These guys have been on tour for quite a while right now, and I think I don't need to really introduce you. I'll let them introduce themselves. But I do want to thank the Wilkinson Public Library, of course, our collaborative partner. We don't really have much of a space for things like this, so we love this space. We'll bring the face, or in this case, faces. And Angelina Wolf, who's not here right now, but she's the one that gave me a call and said, hey, I have a friend and he wrote this book, and it would be really great for Telluride to see these guys. Here's the contact information, and boom, there you go. So if you ever feel or have a connection to an author that you think a Telluride audience would enjoy, by all means, call the store, let us know, or let the library know, and we'll collaborate and make it happen. And I'd love to thank Kodo Radio for doing a news story. It's very rare that we get a news story for an author event. The Daily Planet that Telluride Watch, Plum TV, we did a little stint there on Sunday morning. And I guess I have to thank Facebook. Why? Because it was a great reaction that we were having, and Mark as well through his page. And then afterwards, we do have books to sell if you haven't gotten one yourself that Mark will sign. Yes, we are accepting. Has not quit money, and the store still tries to, not be a nonprofit, if that makes sense. And then we'd like to go up to the Last Dollar Saloon if anyone wants to. No pun intended, really. Okay, maybe. For a beer. And just to round things out, Daniel's not up here yet, but when he comes up, this is a gift from, I think, the bookstore, but also from our town. It's the Free Box book. Which I think you won't mind having in your cave or sharing it or giving it away, but it's about taking if you need and receiving without guilt, just like I've read in the book. And so hopefully, Daniel, you enjoy this, and so does Mark, as a gift from Telluride and the bookstore. All right, I introduce Mark Sundin, the author, and he'll introduce Daniel momentarily. Thanks.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. This has been pretty exciting. We were in Grand Junction last night. We were in Paonia the night before. We were in Durango. We were in Moab, Salt Lake. And this is it's been so incredible to watch how this book is starting to kind of catch a hold, because this is my fourth book. And I've always had this belief that all publishing started and ended in New York City, that you had to get in the New York Times review, you had to get, the television support, you had to get Barnes & Noble and Amazon to support you and be a part of that establishment. And this book hasn't had any of that support. Instead, I've been on this tour with Daniel with only independent bookstores, and everywhere we've gone so far, which has been Southern California, what's called the Mountain Plains District, and the Rocky Mountain District. These are independent bookstore zones. The book has got on like the top 15, and that's just amazing. And it's so gratifying to realize that this old-fashioned system of selling books actually works. And yeah, so thanks to Diva and to Bobby for making this happen, and for even just for having a bookstore in a town like this. It's so rare. You don't even, maybe you know this, but you can go to towns that are much bigger than this, that don't have an independent bookstore at all. And when someone calls the owner when someone calls the manager of Barnes & Noble and says, hey, I've got this friend who's written this book, do you want to have an event? It's like, click. And so it really works. It really works, this idea that people who own bookstores actually read them and actually know what the people who live in their town are interested in. It's a really incredible system. And so thanks everyone for supporting it, and thanks to the library for having us here. But I've seen some great libraries in Colorado and Utah in the past 2 weeks. The other thing I want to say is, having lived in Moab for 11 years, I think that people who live in this part of the country, the Four Corners and the Colorado Plateau, really are getting this book. They understand this idea that seems kind of crazy and silly to people on the coasts of, like, leaving your ambition and maybe your chance of making more money, of having a prestigious career, leaving all that and coming to a place where you can have potentially a simpler life and more freedom and a closer connection with the natural world. And that's why this region of the country is interested in this book, I think. And as you know, or you might know, Daniel Suelo has lived in Moab for the past 20 years, and he's from this part. Okay, so I'm going to start reading. I'm going to read about a chapter and a half, and this will answer a lot of the questions that you might have. And I should say before this that my previous books that I wrote were really funny. And now I'm in this dilemma because I've written kind of a serious book. It's all about God and death and the meaning of life and the collapse of the economy and the collapse of the planet and all these ideas. And so it's hard because when I read it, people don't laugh, and so I can't really tell if they're listening. And I'm used to, as I said, I used to be funny. Someone once read my second book and she said, "I didn't know you were funny." Anyway, so if you hear anything that I read that is even vaguely funny, like if you can even imagine how it might have been funny to someone else, I just invite you to laugh. It'll make me feel better. All right, so I'm going to start right here in chapter 1. In the first year of the 21st century, a man standing by a highway in the middle of America pulled from his pocket his life savings, $30, laid it inside a phone booth, and walked away. He was 39 years old, came from a good family, and had been to college. He was not mentally ill, nor an addict. His decision appears to have been an act of free will by a competent adult. In the 12 years since, as the Dow Jones skyrocketed to its all-time high, Daniel Suelo has not earned, received, or spent a single dollar. In an era when anyone who could sign his name qualified for a mortgage, Suelo did not apply for loans or write IOUs. He didn't even barter. As the public debt soared to 8, 10, finally $13 trillion, he did not pay taxes or accept food stamps, welfare, or any other form of government handout. Instead, he set up house in the Utah Canyonlands, where he forages mulberries and wild onions, scavenges roadkill raccoons and squirrels, pulls expired groceries from dumpsters, and is often fed by friends and strangers. He writes, "My philosophy is to use only what is freely given or discarded and what is already present and already running. While the rest of us grapple with tax deductions, variable rate mortgages, retirement plans, and money market accounts, Suelo no longer holds as much as an identification card. Yet the man who sleeps under bridges and prospects and trash cans is not a typical hobo. He does not panhandle, and he often works, declining payment for his efforts. While he is driven by spiritual beliefs and longings, he is not a monk, nor is he associated with any church. And although he lives in a cave, he is not a hermit. He is relentlessly social, remains close with friends and family, and engages in discussions with strangers via the website he maintains from the public library. He has crisscrossed the West by bicycle, hopped freight trains, hitched through nearly every state in the Union, hauled nets on a Bering Sea trawler, harvested mussels and kelp from Pacific beaches, spearfished salmon in Alaska streams, and braved 3 months of storms atop an ancient hemlock tree. I know it is possible to live with zero money," Suelo declares, "abundantly." As it happens, I had met Suelo long before he gave up money in the desert outpost of Moab, Utah, a haven for seekers and dropouts. We ran in the same circle, worked a stint together as cooks, and squatted on public lands, not as a statement against something, but because we didn't want to pay rent. We had both gone truant from career paths because we were angry about the way the world was and had no means of changing it. Well, if we couldn't overthrow the bastards, then at least we wouldn't enter data in their cubicles, buy junk in their big boxes, and make payments on their land crunchers. But over the years, we drifted our separate ways, geographically and otherwise. By the time I set out to find him again, we hadn't had a conversation in more than a decade. I had heard of Daniel's attempts to live without money, and I'd assumed he'd simply lost his mind. For my part, I was no longer an itinerant river guide living in my truck on $8,000 a year, but a professional rider now and then passing through town to pull weeds and repair the plumbing at my rental property, a trailer on an acre of tumbleweeds whose market value had tripled in 3 years. Thank you very much. My one connection to this notorious cave dweller was that he had friended me on Facebook. I'd seen him once in the intervening years, though. On a visit to Moab, I had glanced at a shaggy, gray-haired man across the aisle at the market. We made tentative eye contact. He looked familiar, but could this old guy, gray in the muzzle, with deep lines on his face and pants worn thin, could this be the Daniel I had cooked with a decade before? He smiled at me, but the sight of his teeth, dark and crooked, rotting right there in his mouth, it chilled me. As much as I supported a person's right to voluntary poverty, here at the height of America's greatest prosperity, I drew the line at bad teeth. I should not be forced to look at such a sorry mouth. The sight made me ashamed of my own excellent dental condition, my disposable income, my rental property, as if he'd accused me directly. My shame made me mad. It was a free country, I conceded, and Suelo had every right to sleep in the dirt and lasso grasshoppers, or whatever. But how dare he sit in judgment of me? By now I had recognized my old acquaintance beyond doubt, but I did not take his hand, offer my friendship, ask about his health. I didn't even say hello. My jaw tightening, I threw him a nod and escaped to my car. The truth was, I'd come to like money. In fact, I'd always liked it. When I was a boy, I counted and recounted the coins I collected in a tin can, packing pennies and nickels into paper rolls and depositing them at the bank, greatly satisfied as my fortune grew on the passbook. I also liked what money represented, the entire system of trade and credit and saving. As I grew up, money served me well. I started getting paid to do what I wanted, like writing books. Money allowed me to test my wits, to save, to gamble, to win. Even in my days of living in a tent, the act of saving money allowed me more freedom. And now, when I hunted for a used car below Blue Book value or refinanced my house at a lower rate, I felt like I'd outwitted the system. After surviving well into my 30s with only the possessions that could fit inside the bed of a pickup, I began to reap the rewards of my pennies saved and pennies earned. I acquired a second car and a second house. Okay, that first was a single wide. I contributed to a retirement account and filed 53 pages of tax returns in 3 different states. I possessed, somehow, 6 pairs of skis. Is that all? Nice. Then came 2008. $20 trillion in world assets were incinerated by bad mortgages and speculation. The real estate bubble splattered into foreclosure and bankruptcy, taking down with it the pensions and savings and jobs of millions of people. My paltry retirement account became 50% paltrier. Magazines that employed me furloughed staff or shut down altogether. Budget cuts would eventually eliminate my college teaching job. Suddenly, that big monthly payment on my home didn't seem like money well spent. I could paint all I wanted, but no number of trips to Home Depot would make the house worth what I had paid for it. And those naysayers who forecast that my generation, those of us born in the 1960s and 70s, would be the first in American history to be worse off than our parents. Maybe they had a point. Suelo, meanwhile, had gained a little notoriety. Thanks to stories in Details magazine and the Denver Post, an interview with the BBC, even the pages of Ripley's Believe It or Not. His blog and website got tens of thousands of hits. As I pored over the writings he had compiled from Thomas Jefferson and Socrates and St. Augustine, I began to think about the choices he had made, bad teeth and all. Here was someone who had said all along what the rest of us were being forced to contemplate for the first time now that our bubble of prosperity had burst. Money was an illusion. He said, I simply got tired of acknowledging as real this most common worldwide belief called money. I simply got tired of being unreal. Daniel had opted out entirely, rejected what I had pursued. I wondered whether, apart from everything he rejected, there was something he embraced. What was I missing out on? Finally, I decided to drive to the Utah desert and find out for myself. I returned to Moab. I was staying with friends, a married couple named Matthew and Melanie. I had exchanged a few emails with Suelo, but we had failed to make a foolproof plan. Of course, he had no phone. And apart from any question of cave etiquette, was it okay to just drop by? I didn't know where to locate him in the vast wilderness. I sent an email, then sat back and hoped that he wandered out of the canyon soon and logged in at the library. A day passed. It was fall and the air was sunny and cool and crisp. I sat on my friend's porch, sipping a glass of fresh watermelon juice. My host, Melanie, Melony, that's her real name, I swear. She considered watermelon a wonder food, filled with antioxidants and electrolytes and vitamins. She swore it had cured her of a 5-year illness that no doctor, medication, or allergy panel could solve. And she drank the red potion 3 times a day, stuffing rinds and seeds and everything into a blender. But with the harvest over and both markets in town sold out, she was running low. With winter approaching, she was contemplating something desperate, like ordering them on the internet. Another day passed, and still no word from Suelo. And then as I sat on the porch checking my watch, an apparition appeared. A bicycle was approaching, dark mount, dark rider. Horn-rimmed glasses emerged between gray hair and beard. The rider wore a black felt bolero cinched under his chin with a stampede strap held snug by a tin brooch. His gaze was forward, serene. Although his legs were clearly pumping, his body gave the impression of utter calm. As he pedaled toward me, I made out a plastic crate of apples and oranges lashed to the rear rack. I would not have been surprised had he let go of the handlebars, plucked out the fruit, and began to juggle. I rushed into the street and called, "Daniel!" He slowed to a halt and turned the bike around. "Oh, it's you," he said. For a dude who lives in a cave, Suelo displayed a positively keen sense of style. His trousers were a few inches too long, cuffed with rolls above boxy workman's shoes. A plaid flannel over a tight black t-shirt revealed a slice of trim belly above a leather belt. He looked like a cross between a Great Depression hobo and a vagabond French painter. Buster Keaton meets Paul Gauguin. Unsure what to do next, I threw my arms around him in a clumsy hug. He smelled like wood smoke. I invited him inside and introduced him to Melanie and her husband Matthew. Melanie poured tall glasses of watermelon juice, the last of her cash, she told us. Suelo perked up. Above his right eye there is a scar that causes the brow to rise in a sharp peak, giving the perpetual appearance of intense curiosity. "Do you know about the melon patch?" he said. We didn't. "That field between the creeks," he said, nodding across the street. "There's hundreds of melons over there. Watermelon, Crenshaws, squash, and pumpkins, too. I've been eating them for months." "Well, whose are they?" I said. "Some guy," he shrugged. "After Obama was elected, he thought the whole system would collapse, so he planted his fallow fields. But the end times didn't come, so he left everything to rot." Matthew and Melanie and I followed Suelo out of the house and onto the street. He pushed his bike along the paved road until it turned to dirt, leading us to a field nestled between 2 creeks, a green swath of desert farmland that had survived from pioneer days. Someone had planted all kinds of trees and vines that grew out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food, peach trees, pear trees, apple trees. Only the serpent and the naked lady were missing. And there were hundreds of melons, a cornucopia, some tucked green into the rows of thistle and tumbleweed, others already yellow mush swelling in the sun. Suelo cradled a sound one like a baby and thwapped it with his thumb. "If the thud is too deep, it's overripe," he said. We wandered the rows, tapping and listening. "Does anyone have a knife?" Melanie asked. Suelo had left his on the bike, but no matter. He picked up a melon the size of a pony keg. He raised it overhead and then heaved it down, and it burst at his feet with a whump. He knelt beside it, scooped up the flesh and lapped it from his palms. And then, verily, he fed our multitude. Wordlessly, Matthew and Melanie shoveled watermelon into their mouths as the syrup dripped toward their elbows. I buried my face till my nose bumped against rind. We busted melons open, one after another, some putrid, others green, some delectable. It was cool and dry and sunny, and the sandy soil was wet after the first big rain of October. The field was ringed by cottonwoods exploding in yellow like a million kernels of popcorn. Between the trees, the red cliffs Beyond the trees, the red cliffs bore down, and above them the snowy peaks thrust through a ring of clouds into the blue sky. We all ate and were satisfied. The number of those who ate was 4. Looking across the fields, we could see that Matthew and Melanie's house stood just 100 yards away, a literal stone's throw from this Eden. It seemed truly mystical that unfindable, moneyless Suelo had materialized from the ether and led us across the desert to Melantopia, to the abundance. Matthew and Melanie and I filled our arms with melons, hoarding them like eye gadgets we'd liberated from Best Buy after a hurricane. But Suelo chose only a single small green fruit. He lowered it into his crate and silently pedaled off. All right, that's the end of chapter 1. I'm going to get some water over here.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
I usually break a melon on my forehead because then you don't get any sand on it.
Ooh, that's a good idea. Are you the guy with more than 6 pairs of skis? I have a couple announcements to make. If you're in the other room watching me on TV, there's some seats inside. There's like a 5-second delay. So I had another announcement. Oh yeah, Diva thanked Angelina, who is now here. Thank you, Angelina, for putting this whole thing together. And I just saw my friend Joni, who I haven't seen in 10 years. And right before you walked in, I was talking about just like that freedom that we got from living out here and working in the woods and working in the desert. So I worked with Joni for, 21 days on a canyon outward bound style trip. And she's always been an inspiration when it comes to being free and being in nature. So thanks for coming. Good to see you. I'm going to read about 4 more pages, and then then Daniel's going to come up, and we're going to answer questions. Before that, does anyone have any questions more like about the book itself? Because we've been doing this for 3 weeks, that once we start talking about God and the meaning of life and the economy, like any questions about the book itself seem to get lost in the wind. But I'll field some of those now if anyone has a question about that.
Do you have a hard time getting it published?
The question was, did I have a hard time getting it published? And the answer is absolutely not. This is one of the things that makes me believe in sort of Daniel's philosophy that things come your way at the right time in your life. This is my 3rd book, or no, this is my 4th book. I'd had 3 before, and I'd kind of had this sort of, honestly, like a chip on my shoulder because I live in Montana. I'd lived in Moab for 11 years, and I always thought, God, if I lived in New York, I would make a lot more money as a writer. I'd get better assignments. My books would sell more. And a couple of years ago, there was a story about Daniel in a magazine in Details, and these publishers in New York City read about it on the internet, and they wrote to him and they said, hey, would you want to write a book? And he said, maybe, but I'd want you to give it away if I did. And this was Penguin. This is like an international conglomerate corporation. And they said, well, maybe we could come up with plan B. And then, so the editor of a previous book knew that I'd lived in Moab, and he called me up and he said, I hadn't heard from him in 5 or 6 years. He said, hey, didn't you live in Moab? Have you ever heard of this guy in the cave? I said, oh, which guy in the cave? There's lots down here in Moab. And I said, actually, I do know him. I mean, I've known him for 20 years, since before he gave up money. And the next thing I know, I had like a book contract without even writing a book proposal, which doesn't really happen. And they gave me enough money that I was able to, I had to still keep my teaching job, but I was able to stop freelancing for magazines for 2 years and write this book, which was such a gift. And now that I'm done with the book, I realized that, like, had I lived in New York for the past 15 years, I couldn't have really written this, because having had that shared experience with Daniel of like being young and like working as line cooks in a restaurant in a tourist town in the middle of nowhere, like that's something that a lot of people don't get. And I think that, and Daniel and I talk about this all the time now, it's like, it does seem like fate now that we met 20 years ago, and now here I am writing a book about it and all this stuff. But yeah, the publishing process, it came to me. All I had to do was sign the paper, basically. It was just amazing. What else? Any other questions? Yeah.
Didn't a lot of people probably approach Daniel and want to write a book? And how come he let you write the book?
Yeah, the answer to the first question is money. I mean, and that was the impression. That's always the impression of the people when they first hear about him, is that he's crazy. That was my impression. So, no, I don't think people saw that it was. It seemed. I think most people who, when they heard about him, they thought it was so radical that no one could relate. And so my editor, I think, had the wisdom to see that, hey, there's Matt. This is another one of my closest friends from childhood who's wandered in. Christina Callicott's here? Oh, wow, this is so great. It's like, this is your life. Why is it that all my friends showed up late? I'm sorry, what was the question? There was a part 2 to that question. I don't remember what it was.
Why did he let you?
Oh, why did he let me write it? Yeah, well, we can ask him that later, but the short answer is that he thought it sounded like a fun idea. And he didn't accept any money. And he did ask. He said, well, I think it would be great if you guys could make some books available for free. And miracle of miracles, Penguin agreed. And they've given away over 1,000 books now to churches, colleges, libraries. We're going back to Missoula in 2 weeks. And they've given 150 books to our community there. We're having like a panel discussion with community-supported agriculture people and like the Free Cycles people and the Occupy people. And so it's been amazing that they're actually getting in the spirit of the book. Yeah. But we'll ask Daniel more about why he is doing this when he comes up here. Anything else? Okay. I'm going to read 4 more pages. Our whole society is designed so that you have to have money, Suelo says. You have to be a part of the capitalist system. It's illegal to live outside of it. He had a point. Our national identity is enmeshed with the idea of private property. Our right to it is enshrined in the 14th Amendment, which guarantees that we not be deprived of it any more than our lives or liberty without due process of law. The flip side of this protection of property holders, however, is a lack of protection for the propertyless. And nowhere is this more apparent than with respect to real estate. The American Indian belief that man can no more own land than he can own air or sunlight was quashed with the arrival of Europeans. The ground beneath their feet was available for the taking, and over a period of 3 centuries, white people took it until the frontier closed around the year 1900, after which all real estate in America was spoken for. The legal supremacy of private property, a relatively recent human invention, is cemented in the American logic as indisputable as the laws of physics. If you step off the roof, gravity will pull you to the ground. If you don't pay the rent, you'll be evicted. And if you squat in an abandoned building, you are guilty of trespassing. Even lands set aside for the public do not welcome a man without money. While a company may drill a mine or erect an oil rig on federal property, a citizen is prohibited from building a cabin there. Homesteading has been outlawed for more than a century. Visitors to national forests must vacate their campsites after 14 days and pay a nightly fee. Living in city parks and on sidewalks is deemed vagrancy and banned in most places. The punishment for sleeping in an unused public space that requires little upkeep, under a railroad trestle or along a river, is often to sleep in an expensive jail built with tax dollars. Suelo has defied these laws. His primary residence is the canyons near Arches National Park, where he has lived in a dozen caves. In the fall of 2002, 2 years after quitting money, he homesteaded a majestic alcove high on a cliff, 200 feet across and 50 feet tall. Its sculpted mouth was windblown into smooth symmetry. Sitting inside and gazing into the gorge below felt like heralding himself to the world from inside the bell of a trumpet. Suelo's grotto was a 2-hour walk from pavement, and believing he was unlikely to be disturbed, he settled in for the long haul. He chipped at the rocky ground to create a wide, flat bed and lined it with tarps and pads and sleeping bags that had been left out with someone else's trash. He stacked rocks to block the wind and built wood-burning cook stoves from old tin cans. He learned to forage for cactus pods, yucca seeds, wildflowers, and the watercress that grew in the creek. From dumpsters, he stockpiled dry goods like rice and beans and flour and sealed them in plastic buckets. He drank from springs, bathed in the creek. He washed his clothing by weighting it overnight with a river rock, dried it on the hot sandstone. He arranged on stone slabs a library of books. From a chunk of talus he carved a statue, a ponderous head like some monolith from Easter Island. In warm months, the cave attracted occasional hikers, and when Suelo was away, he left a note. "Feel free to camp here. What's mine is yours. Eat any of my food, read my books. Take them with you if you'd like." Visitors left notes in return, saying they were pleased with his caretaking. And then, one day, after several years of peace, a ranger from the Bureau of Land Management arrived to evict him. Suelo had long since violated the 14-day limit. "If I were hiking along here and I saw this camp," said the ranger, "I'd feel like I wasn't allowed here, that this was someone else's space. But this is public land, and you're making a high impact here." Suelo said, "Who do you think is making a higher impact on the earth, me or you?" The ranger wrote a ticket for $120. "Well, I don't use money," Suelo said, "so I can't pay this." Not only did he not use money, he had discarded his passport and his driver's license. The ranger felt conflicted. He'd spent years chasing vandals and grave robbers through these canyons. He knew that Suelo was not harming the land. In some ways, Suelo was a model steward. The ranger offered to drive him to the next county to see a judge and resolve the citation. The next day, this penniless hobo and federal law enforcer climbed into a shimmering government-issued truck and sped across the desert. As they drove, Suelo outlined his philosophy of moneyless living, while the ranger explained why he'd become a land manager, to stop people from destroying nature. "And then someone like you comes along," he said, "and I struggle with my conscience." Suelo hears this all the time, that we're living in different times now, that however noble his values, their practice is obsolete. He even heard it once when he knocked on the door of a Buddhist monastery and asked to spend the night, and a monk informed him that rates began at $50. The Buddha himself would have been turned away, Suelo observed. "We're living in a different age than the Buddha," he was told. But Suelo simply doesn't accept this distinction. Whether today or 2,000 years ago, he believes public spaces are for the public, and he need not ask permission to occupy one. When a policeman asks what he's doing as he hitchhikes into town or pulls a pizza from a dumpster, he says, "I'm walking in America." It resonates with cops, Suelo says. A lot of them are very patriotic, many are veterans, and they understand that every citizen should have the right to walk in this country. To the Utah judge casting about for an appropriate sentence, Suelo questioned the purpose of the 14-day camping limit. Does it have anything to do with justice or protecting the environment? No, it's to keep people like me from existing. Daniel offered to do jail time or community service. "I don't think jail would be appropriate," said the judge. Like the ranger, the monk, and the many cops who meet Suelo, the judge just didn't know what to do with someone who refused to abide one of our culture's most basic premises, the use of currency as a means of exchange. Finally, he said, "Well, what do you think you should have to do?" Suelo suggested service at a shelter for abused women and children. They agreed on 20 hours. Suelo volunteered regularly at the shelter anyway. So the punishment was a bit like sending Brer Rabbit back to the briar patch. And within a few weeks of eviction from his grand manor, he found a new cave, this time a tiny crevice where he would not be discovered. This is a nation that professes to be a Christian nation, he tells me, and yet it's basically illegal to live according to the teachings of Jesus. All right, thank you. That's the end of the reading. So I guess I'll just introduce Daniel himself. Daniel Suelo, come on up and we'll take your questions. Hi. Let's see. We could start by asking you the question that they asked me just a minute ago. Why did you agree to do this book?
Well, I was a little bit wary of it at first when Penguin asked me, and then they asked me, well, what if we have somebody else write the book? And I said, well, maybe I'll have to think about it. And then Mark himself emailed me back a few days later and told me his vision of the book and how he wanted to concentrate on the spiritual aspects of it and like what basically the philosophy of living moneyless. And I felt good about that, and I felt like I already knew Mark and I trusted him, so I said yes. And it's kind of amazing. It does feel like fate. Like I feel like nobody else could have done it, and I'm not sure if I could have agreed to anybody else doing it.
Let's see. Who's got a question? Yes.
Hi, I came here tonight mostly to ask you about what you've answered a lot already. In this town, I've been here since '77, and I've been a Woodsy, and I know so many people who've been punished so severely for trying to live basically in harmony with the environment around here to this day. And we always have all new council members, and back in the old day, I actually got council to open campgrounds for poor people, and they were always closed. Same excuse: the rich people don't like it. Stop being poor. And I'm so amazed that you managed to pull it off, because especially in Utah, man, San Miguel County's all, oh, we're so liberal. And you hang anybody who is even remotely, truly environmental. I mean, I went decades here without being in a moving automobile, and was called crazy, ridiculed, teased. You know, by my closest friends. I went around this town with $1,000 cash one day, offering it to anybody else who'd go 1 year without being in a car. And there were no takers, and we're talking dreadlock, vegetarian, woodsies, who would take $1,000 to go 1 year without being in a car. And it was then that I realized that rather than getting stressed and being angry and protesting and being incarcerated and paying fines, that I would just laugh at the confusion and the decay and the chaos. And it's gotten to the point where in the last few years, man, it's really going down fast now. It's starting to show. This evening in Denver, the news was all about round up anybody who's camping and treat them like criminals. All the shelters are full and they're flowing out on the streets, so boy, we better do something about it because the rich people don't like the way it looks. And it only gets worse. In Seattle, they got the campground there named after the mayor or something because there were so many people in it. Yeah, it's. I'm going to openly admit right here in public, I'm planning on building again on public lands in a place where I won't hurt anything and do a large permaculture garden. I'm going to move there at night because you can't see anything with their GPS cameras and everything, you know?
Thank you.
Well, the thing is, you know, if you want land in this country, basically you have to conquer it.
That's true.
You go out and you take it.
Yeah, I have a friend in Moab. He's lived outdoors. He's more of a hermit. Like but he's the coolest guy. He's probably nearing 70 now. Nick Hogan. I think Life magazine did an article on him way back when. But for years, BLM has been trying to get him out of there, and he's like stealthily moved around. And finally, and I talked to him a few years ago, and he said, well, finally I'm living on public land legally. But he was like giving my blessing, giving me his blessing to live the way I'm doing. And I said, well, how are you living legally on public land? He said, well, I got a mining claim. He found some hematite crystals and was making jewelry with them. And that's the ironic thing. If you are using the land, and if you find minerals or whatever and you're mining it, then you can legally live on it. But if you're leaving it alone and just minding your own business, you are a criminal.
So I did that just last year at the BLM here in Colorado, because I wanted to do a mining claim place. And the hoops they expect you to jump through are really silly, and you can have all the buildings you want for bulldozers and dynamite and stuff.
Yeah.
But forget about living on that property.
Right?
Huh.
Just hilarious. You have to have a residence elsewhere if you're doing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't want anybody trying to be free.
Yeah, and
Free
this is why the Native Americans were rounded up and put in concentration
We're all
camps.
trespassing right here. Did you know that this land is in default? We were supposed to give the Utes 100 years ago $10,000. We never gave them. And basically, the one person who could have any legal jurisdiction here in the San Juan Mountains is a federal marshal. There are no private properties here. There's no foreign country. We're all trespassing here. That's the law. I've been to the courthouse recently in the last few years, asked them for the piece of paper. It doesn't exist. Where the transfer from the Ute Indian Nation to white man for it was a deal we cut and a promise that we never kept.
Well, the problem is that...
And yet they don't care because it comes so far with the game. It's just going to break.
The problem is
it can't be fixed.
I think the problem is that you can't raise $10,000 in this town to pay for the land. Anyone else have a question?
Sure.
Yeah, right here.
Would you elaborate a little on the spiritual element that drew you together and how that kind of is an undercurrent of this book?
The question is, can he elaborate on the spiritual element that drew him into this life?
Yeah, basically I was raised in a very evangelical Christian household, fundamentalist, and I took my religion very seriously as a kid. But and I remember discussing this with my brother. We were in grade school, and we would like ask each other, like, wow, it's like, why don't we ever really follow the teachings of Jesus? It's like, and this periodically went through my mind. Wow, it's like we're fundamentalists, and yet we're not really following the very fundamentals of our religion. And also, we were raised in different places in Colorado. We lived in Conifer and Evergreen, as well as Denver and Grand Junction. And my dad took us camping all the time, like almost every couple weekends. And I loved nature and just watching nature, and it was just, the dichotomy between nature and commercial civilization was so apparent in my mind. And then as I got older, when I left home for college, I started expanding my vistas to other cultures and other religions. And I think the first scripture I read besides the Bible was the Tao Te Ching, and it blew me away. The similarities between that and the core of Christianity. I felt like if you stripped away all of the trappings of Christianity, you would have the Tao Te Ching, you would have Taoism. And then I studied like the Dhammapada, Buddha, and Bhagavad Gita, Hinduism, and the Quran, and I started seeing the same similarity among all the religions. It's like the one thing that they all have in common, which is the one thing that few people actually follow in religion, is the idea of giving up possessions and doing for the sake of doing, not expecting anything in return, which is really what money represents. It represents expectation of reward. And money itself represents not itself, but it represents past and future, but it never represents the present, if you really think about that. Like if you look at a dollar bill, we call a dollar bill money, but it does not represent the dollar bill. Like few people look at it and see, wow, this is a picture of George Washington or Lincoln or whatever. It's like what it represents is an idea in the head. It represents a value, something you're going to buy in the future, or some work you did in the past. If it represented itself, it would not be money. And thinking about money, it's like, what is money? It isn't the dollar bill. It isn't a piece of paper. It isn't a coin. It isn't even a blip in a computer. It's purely a belief in the head. Even the word credit means belief. The root, credibility, creder, creed. And then it dawned on me, yeah, creed. Money is a creed. It's a religion. And it's the most common religion in the world that most all adults believe in. And also, this had to do with who is my real self. Like if I'm doing something in order to get something in return, that's the definition of ulterior motivation. I'm not being real. If I'm doing something for you because I want something else, I'm not being real with you. And and then I thought about the idea of prostitution. The idea, like I tried Googling this a long time ago, like the phrase, the world's oldest profession, like where did that phrase come from? But I started understanding it, because it is the world's oldest profession. It's really the only profession in the world. And prostitution is the most honest profession there is, because you see it for what it is. You are doing in order to get money, and everybody knows it. The love isn't real.
We do it all.
What's that?
We do it all.
We all do it.
We
Yeah,
all do it.
exactly.
We all do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I was, as I got older, like in the 90s, I worked social work. And one of the rules of social work was, okay, the rules of professionality are that you don't have personal relations with the clients. You have relations with a client until 5 o'clock. Then when the bell rings, no more. It's like you meet them on the street and you pretend like you don't know them or just an acquaintance. But before then, you can, show them compassion or whatever. And that's what I did. And by 5 o'clock, I was too exhausted anyway to have any relations with anybody. And I'd walk home. In Denver, I lived in Denver at the time, and I'd walk home and I'd walk through one of the worst parts of town, and I'd see some of my clients. I'd see other homeless people, and thinking in my head, fuck off. I've been helping people like you all day. And I found that I actually hated homeless people. And then I would get home. I'd get to my apartment, and my neighbor would knock on the door and, hey, you want to hang out, have a beer or whatever? And I said, no, I'm too tired. I just want to watch TV or go to bed or whatever. And and then I was going through severe depression also. And I thought, one day it dawned on me, wow, I'm loving everybody but my neighbor. Especially like literally my neighbor coming over. I thought, wow, I don't have the capacity to love my neighbor. I'm loving people I'm paid to love, and also I was sending money overseas to different, I was like proud of that. Sending money to save the children or whatever. And thinking, wow, I'm just loving everybody except my neighbor. And you know, and I, yeah, and it took me the 90s to like work through this, till I realized that I wanted to experiment with living without money and to find a way of being completely myself and being able to work from my heart rather than to get something else or to live somewhere else other than here and now. I could go on with the philosophy of this, but
I'll give another answer to that question from a more little analytical perspective, is that there is this tradition of renunciates in all of the world's religions. In modern religion, I mean, in India, in Hinduism, there's these men, and I guess some women called sadhus. You've probably seen pictures of them with their dreadlocks, and they're covered in clay, and they hang out in front of the temples, and they live without money. And Islam and in Buddhism, there's similar people. And even in Christianity, there's a long history of renunciation, like St. Francis of Assisi, who said, you know, if we embrace holy poverty, the world will feed us abundantly, or something like that. It's really been lost in modern Christianity and modern America. And when in the book I say, you know, can you imagine if our priests and ministers and nuns like went door to door asking for food? Because you know that happens in other countries and other religions. It doesn't happen here anymore. But anyway, Suela spent some time in India with sort of studying Hinduism, and some time in Thailand in a Buddhist monastery, which is kind of where he got all of these ideas synthesized. Yes?
I just think that's interesting because my mom has a Buddhist monk sister, and she's all about donating to the local temple and going to certain festivals and giving out donations to those institutions. And she also gives money to her sister, but in her head, she's just thinking, why is she not getting a job? And when my brother, you know, went to Santa Cruz, started off, you know, working really hard his first year, and then all of a sudden became Buddhist and a protester and an activist, she was just really, really upset with the lifestyle he was choosing because it wasn't mainstream and you weren't going to get the American dream. But I think it's really interesting how people, you know, they may act a certain way, but never think that way when it comes to their owns or their neighbors or anything like that.
yeah, it's interesting. Well, I would like to clarify that I don't want to discourage people from, you know, I don't think money is evil, and I don't want to discourage people from donating to different causes. But if it's substituting for loving our neighbor who's in our presence, then I would question the motivations of that. But when you're talking, it reminded me of another situation. I was with my friend Satya. He was ordained a Buddhist monk in Japan, and we hung out together. We traveled together a little bit in California, camped out in Marin County for a little bit. But one day we went to, I forget, we went into some shop. It was a Buddhist artifact shop, and went in there, and Satya just started talking to the proprietor of the store, and she asked us what we were doing, and we told her, and she said, well, you know, that's extremist. She said, you know, we need to take the middle way between extremes, and you guys are living an extremist life. And then Satya said, well, that's interesting, because the person who coined the phrase, the middle way, said it's the middle way between extremes. That was the Buddha, and he lived without money and possessions. So maybe we should rethink what does it mean? What does extremist mean? And I thought about that more after that. I thought, yeah, is a bird an extremist? A bird has no money and possessions. Is a worm an extremist? A dog? You know? And I thought about that. I thought, this is not about asceticism. It's not about self-torture. And they're both really the same. Like if we take less than we need, we're an extremist. If we take more than we need, we're an extremist. I feel like the secret of life is taking only what we need in the present moment. And that's the path of joy. And if I'm taking more than I need, I'm an ascetic. I'm living in fear. I'm building up a shell of fear around myself. Like, wow, I'm not realizing the abundance of the universe. And same way, if I'm taking less than I need, it's not about self-torture. It's just about living, like Jesus said, the birds of the air.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, happiness is a decision, not a possession.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to read just like 2 paragraphs here because someone at every time we read is sitting there going, yeah, but the guy just drove here in a car and there's money to put gas in, like the gas tank, and how is that any different than using money? I mean, that's what I'd be thinking. So I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs here that kind of brings us into that whole area. Wait a minute, isn't Suelo just kidding himself? Is there really any difference between accepting a room in a church and a room in a homeless shelter? And isn't hitchhiking in a gas-powered automobile or blogging from a library computer evidence that he is just as dependent on money as the rest of us? If not on the green paper itself, then certainly the commerce without which there would be no cars or gasoline or libraries or computers. Suelo considers these criticisms. He concedes that by using the public library, he is accepting other people's tax money, and for a while considered stopping the practice, accessing the internet only at friends' houses. But ultimately he felt that he was splitting hairs a bit too finely. He certainly wasn't going to stop walking on public roads merely because they were paid for with taxes. Our economic lives are so intertwined that he could never achieve absolute purity. So here's the important part. His intention is to give freely what he has without expectation of return, and to accept without obligation that which is freely given by others.
Yeah, I think I would add to that too that
It's too late, the book's already published.
but also it's about seeing everything for what it is rather than mind. And that's a very Buddhist concept. It's actually the concept, the core of all of the religions. But just seeing people for who they are without a judgment of value. And you think about, like I like to ask people, does a pigeon roosting on a skyscraper, or is that pigeon dependent upon money? Or is an albatross hitching on a boat dependent on money? Or a barnacle on a ship under the sea? Or a bear rummaging through dumpsters? And to me, it goes back to what is money. It's a thought in the head. If I'm conscious of money, whatever I'm doing, then I'm dependent upon money. And if I'm not taking what is in the present, but like the idea is to use what is already available in the present, what is already running, just like a pigeon or an albatross would do.
I'd like to point out that I think for other people to get where you are, they need to start with much